And it says we're recording. How are you, Rebecca?
I'm good, Sean. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. Thank you very much for doing this. As we're recording it, New York is just digging out from a massive snowstorm. In fact, the largest snowstorm in December, 10, 12 years, something like that. So we were just
You,
talking about how your car is still buried and probably will be buried for a while.
yeah, you picked a great day for this because it's not like we could have went anywhere else today.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. So first of all, thank you very much for doing this, even though you're
yeah.
trapped and whatnot, but I appreciate you doing this. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you're a returning guest to the channel, I appreciate your patronage. If you're new to the channel, well, I certainly hope you find this conversation as interesting as I expect it to be. And if you do, make sure you hit the subscribe button with the bell so you'll get a reminder each and every time we post a video, which, by the way, happens every Thursday morning. For those of you who don't know me or need a brief reminder, my name's Sean O'Rourke, and when I'm not talking to interesting people about interesting things, I'm a cyber liability consultant for an insurance brokerage firm in New York City called Combs and Company. Now, Rebecca, you get to tell the fine folks all the things that you do because you're all over the place.
Yes, I like to keep busy, like we were also just talking about
Right.
before we press record. So I always explain myself as a cancer researcher by day and a real estate investor by night. I have worked in cancer research for a little over a decade now. I have been in the field, I have left the field, I've gone back to the field, I have quit it again, and now I'm back in it. Besides that, I've always been an entrepreneur at heart. That's how you and I ended up crossing paths. I've owned a tour company in Spain. I've owned a bar in Portugal. I owned a medical consulting company. I owned a nutrition supplement company. I mean, I've kind of done everything in some capacity. And now I have a business where I help other women become real estate investors. So always moving forward and always looking for the next project.
And you know what? When we do conversation two, we'll talk about all those other ones because your history is pretty amazing. When I finally got to hear it and what have you, I felt totally shortchanged in terms of the insular life that I've led compared to you. But we're going to go, and since you put it this way, all I can think of is the scene, the very famous scene in The Godfather Part 3 is Al Pacino, every time I get out, they pull me back in kind of deal. So you are a cancer researcher.
Correct.
And that's why I'm having you on the show, because it's a topic sort of, for the human race to a certain extent, but it's also hit close to home for a lot of people, including myself. My father-in-law passed away from cancer. My dad had prostate cancer, but survived. And I know a myriad of other people who are currently fighting it or did fight cancer. So, yes. And we're also at the end of this, we're going to equate it to the COVID-19 vaccines that just came out because we're recording this on December 18th, 2020. So there will be a tie-in to COVID, as there is for everything in 2020. But the first question I want to ask you is, I've read quite often and I've heard often that there is no cure for cancer. Is that true, or is it a gray question in terms of yes and no?
Sure. In my opinion, it is true that there is no cure for cancer.
Okay.
And reasonably thinking, there kind of can't be. Really what cancer is it's an abnormality in cells. So from that perspective, yes, that means then there's no cure for cancer. It's cells, unfortunately, there's always going to be something a little bit different, some type of abnormality within them. What, from my perspective, when we say, as somebody that works in the field, that there's kind of that no cure, what we mean for that is we can, when someone is diagnosed with cancer, where it's really problematic in that person's body, the reason that we can't cure it, or that even a person after they go through whatever treatments that they have, we never say that you are cured, because you will still always have a certain percentage of cancer in your body. There's just a difference between where is it manageable or where is it not really affecting you versus where is it now an issue. So we are not trying to cure cancer. We are trying to minimize it.
So when the media says that they're looking for a cure for cancer, the media is doing you a bit of a hype job, I should say, not a disservice, but a
Yes,
hype job. It's not a cure, it's a management of the
correct.
disease.
Correct. It's not the right word. It's not the right word that should be used. It gives people a very different impression. And then it also sets kind of people up for poor expectations in the future if they ever do get sick and they're like, well, now this is incurable. And it's like, okay, well, that's not, yes, for some people, like we cannot get them to a place, unfortunately, where they can live their lives and
Right.
continue on. But that's incurable. But technically everybody is incurable because you will still always have that cancer in you to some capacity.
So I have two questions, and I want to ask one that I didn't have on the list that I sent you
That's
beforehand.
okay.
Does that mean every human being has cancer in some form or another, or do not all humans have sort of the defects in the cells, those in cells sort of replicating in the wrong way?
Sure. In the loosest description of the word cancer, we all have cancer. We all
Okay.
have cells that are abnormal, right? That's just, we are made up of so many cells. How are you going to say that there's not going to be one? It's
Yep.
just not practical, right? Everybody has, even just looking at it from the outside, everybody either has a skin discoloration or they have, that little spot of hair that doesn't necessarily kind of fill in the same way as everything else, or they have a birthmark, right? Those are all technically abnormalities. So that's now you're just thinking about things on the inside that you can't necessarily see. So yes, everybody
Gotcha.
would, but once again, it's not diagnosed, it's not cancer until it now is creating a problem.
Okay, so don't freak out, folks. Don't hit stop and run
Yeah.
away and whatnot. I just wanted to get that out there. So, from a technical perspective, from your perspective as being inside on the research, what exactly is the definition, or what happens in cancer that makes it so difficult for you to treat, to fight, to manage, and so on and so forth? What is happening inside you or within your cells, and then why is that so difficult to get a handle on?
Sure. I actually think this is a great opportunity for almost like a PSA here, that one of the biggest problems is that people don't regularly go see their doctors. So for a lot of what happens in your body is basically those abnormal cells are basically replicating and now a faster rate, right?
Hmm.
So it's perfectly fine to have a certain percentage of your cells that are abnormal. Completely fine. That's why our human race is even able to exist, right? If all those cells replicated too fast, we would not have survived as a species
Sure.
by this point. So what happens is in your body, that particular cell, for whatever reason, is now replicating itself. Our bodies don't have the antibody to fight that off. So now all of a sudden you're having more of these abnormal cells kind of come within your body. Now that's causing problems. The problem is at what point do you realize that that is a problem, and do you do something about it? I think a lot of people don't go for their kind of regular routine annual checkups as they should. Also, a lot of people, you get certain symptoms that you might not associate with anything at that point in time. So maybe you don't go see a doctor. Maybe you don't kind of follow up, or you're like, oh, it's just because I'm getting old, or it's just, this type of cold, or oh, it's just that pain I've always had. And it's like, no, you have to go get those things kind of looked at. And from like a personal story that I can share about that, my grandmother, actually almost every woman on my paternal side of my family dies from breast cancer, ovarian cancer. So that is, my grandmother passed away from ovarian cancer in 2015, and she did not realize it. She had ovarian cancer many years before. Same thing. She went through surgery. She went through the treatments. She actually didn't even know she had cancer until they had opened her up for a routine hysterectomy.
Gotcha.
They found out during that surgery. They actually, when she came out of surgery, the doctor was like, hey, by the way, everything went great with the hysterectomy. And oh, by the way, we think we got all the cancer. And my grandmother was like, nah, that's the wrong chart. Like, and then
Yeah.
they'd actually found that when she was there. So same thing, didn't have symptoms, didn't have any reason to think about it. But same thing, cancer didn't go away. It then started reproducing later, a couple years later. And the thing that was the most difficult for me was after she had passed, I was looking through her planner, her little calendar, and you could see for months the change in my grandmother's handwriting over time. It used to be a very
Interesting.
clear script. And then all of a sudden you could tell She was kind of struggling with like her writing a little bit to almost where it was illegible, up until the couple months before she went into the hospital. So you could see that decline there. But for her, she was just like, I'm old, it's the arthritis, I don't write very much. And, you know, she didn't realize that that was actually a problem. But if anybody else had looked in our planner, maybe we would have said, hey, we need to get you to a doctor sooner than later. And I think that's very common for many people.
And I tend to agree with you. And I have to say that I sometimes go to the doctor kicking and screaming. I just celebrated a milestone birthday.
I
So
know.
I'm going to, luckily my next physical is not till February 2021. So I can wait a few more months before my first colonoscopy. So,
Yep.
not
But happy
exactly.
birthday.
Thank you very much, but still not looking forward to it.
No.
But it is necessary.
Yes.
I've had my PSA test every year since I turned 40. And again, that's not a definitive record, but because of my dad's history, it's something that the doctor wants to keep an eye on. So, in your experience, in terms of research, what types of cancers have you researched
Sure. So
or been involved in?
So my specialty is working with blood cancers. So there's basically two ways to look at cancers. You either have solid tumors or liquid tumors. Solid tumors are kind of what's your tangible, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
lung cancer, stomach cancer, throat cancer, things that usually tend to be masses of that sort. Those are your solid tumors. I work in liquid tumors, which would be your blood cancers. So like your leukemias, lymphomas. So that's actually what I specialize in, is actually lymphomas. That's what I've worked most of my career in. For a small period of time, I did work within our plastics and reconstructive surgery departments, which is then working with more the solid tumor type places, and then figuring out what we can do to kind of give people stability moving forward in life.
Right.
But
And
lymphomas is really my specialty.
so in that regard, is there a difference in terms of the research or how those cancers are handled or treated?
Yes. It's one of the things that makes it the biggest difference from my perspective. So what I do as a researcher is I run clinical trials. So for many years, I worked in the hospital themselves with those patients. We would have a pharmaceutical company contact us, say, hey, we've been working on this drug and developing it in a lab. Well, now we need to be able to give it to humans. So pharmaceutical companies don't have humans. They call up hospitals. They have relationships with doctors. So they would come to us, negotiate contracts, budgets, all that type of thing.
Sure.
But basically, they are outsourcing their research to the hospital for human testing. So my role was actually running those protocols on those patients in those different labs when they would come in. So one of the biggest differences from that perspective for us is how you measure if something is helping or not helping. It's much easier to see with the solid tumor. With that, there's a whole guideline on, well, if the tumor shrank by this percentage or by this percentage, if it's this much smaller, then you're in this type of grade or this type of class, and where it's really much easier to just say, okay, well, it was, 2 centimeters by 3 centimeters last week. Now it's 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. Doesn't take, for the funniest example, like it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that that's progress. With the blood cancer, it does, because the difference is that you don't necessarily have that mass. Now, someone with a blood cancer can spread also to other parts. So same thing that anybody with cancer can have. You start off with lung cancer, but now it's affecting your kidneys, your liver, whatever else. You can still have that in blood cancers as well. But if your main cancer starts as a blood cancer, we have an entirely different system to have to measure that, which is usually much more difficult just because we don't have a tangible item in front of us that we can calculate out.
So how do you measure it then?
So usually we measure it through labs. That's actually one of the easiest ways for somebody to realize if they are sick or if they do have cancer that now needs to be looked after. It's usually, you can tell when you look at somebody's lab reports.
So what do these lab reports contain? I mean, are you just looking at blood? Or are you looking at blood and urine? Or are you looking
No, just blood work.
Okay.
You can tell from blood work. That was actually, I know, I had a health consulting company for health coaching company for many years. And I actually had a client that came to me and he brought me his blood work. And I looked through it and I was like, oh my God, how do I tell this man that he has cancer? I was like, does he know? I
never
was
knew
shocked.
that. That's a
Yeah.
new one.
I did not, and I met him through a friend of mine who was his daughter, and we were all sitting down at, like, we met at a diner in New York City, as you do, right? You just go to a
Yeah.
coffee shop, and I'm looking through this paperwork, and I'm like, oh my God, this man has cancer. Like, this was not mentioned to me. So I actually had to have that conversation with him on the side, being like, hey, just so you know, like, there are definitely some issues you need to talk to, like, your primary care physician about. Like, did you have a follow-up to these labs? And he was like, and he actually then came clean and said, I do know I have cancer, but I didn't tell my daughter yet.
Okay.
So I was like, well, you should have given me a warning. Like, like, it was very difficult for me, like, in this meeting to, like, hide my face
Yeah.
from being like, I have a responsibility to tell this man, and then also tell him to change doctors if his doctor didn't
Well,
tell
I
him.
was going to say that
that.
until you mentioned that he actually did know. I was going to say, well, then that's malpractice on his doctor's
Oh
part.
no, 100%. I would, if I had to be the one to break this news to him, no, that would have been something that I would have been like,
Yeah.
no, you need to, like, one, you need to find another doctor. You need to get involved with an oncologist ASAP, and then three, you need to meet with a lawyer and sue
Yeah.
your old doctor. But luckily he did know, but he just didn't tell his daughter.
Gotcha.
So I was the first and only person that knew for, like, quite some time, which put me in a compromising position.
That's a bad spot to be in.
Yeah, it luckily it worked out. He's been in remission for years, so, good story there. But it is something. So you can usually tell from what those numbers are from simply a blood test. You're
Gotcha.
usually looking at your white blood cells and your red blood cells count. That's usually what, like, I look for. That white blood count is what's going to tell me what's really going on in your body. So from somebody that works with blood cancers, we are measuring, basically, we're grading if some type of chemotherapy or product that we're using is helping you based on what those numbers are. And then also we're then looking secondary into, is this spreading to other areas or not? Because once again, with the blood cancer, there's a little bit of a better chance of that happening.
Well, I was about to say then, it's because you hear the word metastasized a lot. What exactly, from a medical perspective, what does metastasized mean?
Spread, growing.
That's it. Okay.
Yep.
So let's use a really difficult word to say spread, grow.
That actually is how the entire medical field works. So if you've ever tried to read the actual drug name of the product.
Exactly. I was just about to say that. That's why you have these weird names, because there's no way you're going to pronounce the chemical name.
Do you want to know the secret to why those names are so difficult?
Sure.
So when you have to go basically patent anything and have that name, you need something that there's not going to be anything else that's conflicting with it. So if you just take a whole bunch of random letters, put them in whatever order you want, there's no way that the patent office is going to come back to you and be like, actually, like, chrysanthemum is taken. You know what I mean? Like, there's just going to be no chance.
That's fantastic.
That's going to be there. Yep. So that's actually why those are picked.
It all comes down to the money.
Yeah.
But that's just smart. That's just smart business. I mean, you're putting all this research. I mean, I read a statistic that just the federal government alone has contributed $50 billion in cancer research since 1970.
Yeah.
That's so, I mean, that's just accurate. But I mean, that's just publicly known money. I mean, who knows how much of the dark money in the government spreads around has gone through. But I mean, and then you have all the private foundations and the hospitals and the drug companies and everything. I mean, the number has to be astronomical.
Well, that's also where, as a person that does what I do, one of the biggest conspiracy conversations that I always hear about is that we are holding back the cure for cancer because then all these foundations won't have anything to do. All those people will lose their jobs, right? There's no reason to do a fundraiser if we figured out how to cure cancer. So once again, that is not true. We are not, at least from my own personal knowledge, there's nothing that we are holding back. That there are definitely red tape and there are hoops that we have to jump through for a lot of things, but there is not a known answer. Like I said, there's no, you can't cure cancer because cancer is such a variety of things. Right? Blood cancers, as we're talking about, and solid cancers are completely different. There's not going to be like a pill you could take that's going to cure all types of cancers.
Right.
There's not going to just be one thing. And if that one pill might cure you, Sean, but it might not cure me. Like there's not there's just so many different variables.
Right.
There's so many
Everybody's different.
variables.
Well, I mean, in researching a previous episode, I interviewed a friend of mine who at 28, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And she's
Yeah.
31 now. And so we were talking about her treatment process through. But as I was researching it, I mean, they found cancers in fossils as old as 2 billion years old. So my theory is the
Yeah.
moment there was a multicellular organism, there was cancer.
Yes.
Just by its very nature.
Yes. Completely agreed. That is completely accurate. Yes.
Okay.
This has always existed. And once again, the goal is really to mitigate it. What we're looking for is how we can decrease the effects on the body from the cancer.
Right.
Because eradicating it is not possible.
Exactly. And so now I want to ask a question that when I told somebody I was interviewing you and what we were going to talk about, then we started to, dovetail into different conversations. And the question came up, is there a worse cancer to have in terms of, not in terms of how it affects your body, in terms of how hard it is to treat?
Yes, 100%.
Which
There
one?
are definitely the one that when I hear people get that, my mind is like, oh shit, is usually pancreatic cancer.
I knew you were going to say that. I was hoping there was something else, but I knew you were going to say that because everybody says that.
It is. It doesn't give you the signs or symptoms that you would get for other things. It just doesn't. So many people, by the time they're diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, there's not much we can do. It's just that much. That's the problem. There's just none of these outward signs that we know about. So usually that falls under pancreatic cancer.
And there's no way for you to live without your pancreas. So we haven't figured out how to sort of take it out and put in an artificial one, right? So you raise an interesting point, and I've often wondered this. Why don't you get indications earlier? I mean, because there's something in your body that's going wrong, and usually your body has a way of telling you, but to your point that you just made, sometimes it doesn't. And so it seems to be with cancer, that happens quite often. So is there an actual reason why that is?
It would be, well, when you think about it, so we're saying the cancer is this abnormality in cells. So those abnormality in cells has to affect some system to say that something's wrong. Mm-hmm. So once again, if you just have this abnormality of growing cells, right? When you're talking about that idea of that mass, well, okay, well, you can have that mass there, but unless we've all how many times have my husband has one of those ganglion cysts on his wrist.
Oh yeah.
And it's just like a little bump there, right? Just kind of like from overuse. Which is funny. He's a bartender. So now during COVID, that's all he's doing is just making his cocktails every night. So, so he has that ganglion cyst. So he'll feel that and be like, okay, that's a bump, that's a mass. Right. But that's but even for that, how long did he have that before he was able to feel that, right? How many times have we been like, oh, where'd that bruise come from? Where'd that bump come from? Mm-hmm. And, we didn't realize we walked into the corner of the bed or whatever it was, right? Or bumped up against a wall and got bruised. So we're not noticing those signs. For a mass, you have to realize that with the mass, it would have to be something that would be outward, right? So maybe if you had kind of something that was growing on your neck, you would get that, but you're not going to see a mass on your lungs. Then it's going to be, you're not going to see those inward masses. So there's no signal there. So then you have to wait for there to be something being affected. So once again, using the mass in your lung, then you're going to say, okay, well, it's just a little bit harder to breathe. Well, I put on 15 pounds because of COVID. I hit a milestone birthday. It's a little more difficult walking up the stairs. Not for you, Mr. Spartan, but for maybe some of the other listeners out there.
Thank you very much.
So it's all those things that it usually, and that's also something that humans do. We justify what's going on. Mm-hmm. Oh, I haven't been exercising as much now that my gym's closed. So I'm just probably not breathing as well walking up those stairs. I'm just out of shape. And it's like, okay, and we kind of do that, one, because that's kind of our survival. And two, it's really thin scary. We can't go to the doctor every time something's slightly different, something's not completely right. So we have to kind of find that balance. And I think I don't think there's an easy answer for what that balance looks like of when is this justifiable for something going on in my life, getting older, gain some weight, not active as much, versus hey, this is now a problem. So by the time people are even realizing and getting to that a phase where they need to justify which, if they should see a doctor or not, there's already had to have been that cancer growing for quite some time.
Yep.
So then it's when by the time you're diagnosed, you're always behind the 8 ball. You always really are. Because by the time you realize what's going on, and usually same thing, when you go to a doctor, yes, like the blood test is going to help you, but your blood test is only going to show when you have a certain level of cancer.
Right. Yeah.
So at that point, that's where you hear like people saying, oh, well, maybe this pain's from this. I got to go see this specialist. I got to go see this specialist. And then all of a sudden, 6 months later, you find out that it was actually cancer that you had. But that wasn't what was realized at first. So same thing, you're already now, how long have you had that cancer? How far is it advanced by the time you actually realize what's going on? So it's that early detection, which I don't really know. Like I said, I really don't know how we're going to be able to do that any sooner. A lot of people, you look for those genetic kind of strains. You know, you had mentioned your father.
Yep.
Like I said, interestingly, with my grandmother, when she was diagnosed with cancer originally in 2008, being especially the cancer researcher that I am, I was like, Graham, like, you're getting tested for the BRCA gene. Like, you're going to, everything that we can get tested for, like, you're going to go do. And at first she actually didn't want to, which I thought was crazy. And I kind of had to say to her, I'm like, wouldn't you want to know if that's something that I would pass to like my kid, or that like you would have passed like to, dad and me kind of thing.
Yep.
And then, so it took a little bit of convincing to actually get her on board with being tested, which kind of shocked me. And then oddly enough, she came back negative.
So she didn't have the gene, but so again, sorry to interrupt. What's that tell you then?
It tells me, to me, my answer is, it tells me that we don't know what gene is out there. We have not found, to me, it says, it doesn't, to me, I don't hear that as this is random. I hear this as in, we need to do more research into what other genes could be causing this.
Gotcha. Well, and so as everybody knows, I always have my questions, and these are the questions that I had for you and what have you. And I promise I will get to the rest of them. But again, we're just having a conversation, as is our want. We go in different directions. So I have 2 different questions for you on that factor. One, are they doing, I have to assume yes, but are they doing research to develop better mechanisms for early detection of various types of cancers?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Some of the great advancements that we made is in that early detection, which is trying to work on better testing that we can do up front. And also one of probably the biggest advancements that we've actually been able to make in cancer recently is about our scanning, is about different like MRIs, what we can really see and tell from them. The better imaging that we can get, we can kind of help predict that, we can help catch things sooner.
So you mentioned MRIs. Is that akin then to what a PET scan would be once you're going through treatment? Or is there a sort of a preliminary diagnostic PET scan that people could be taking?
No, it's just more, it's actually taking that same PET scan, but we just are making advances in what that looks like.
Okay.
We're just having better precision with that. We are able to justify why those tests need to be done, that you do not, once again, a big part of the medical industry is also insurance. Right. So if, I can't tell you how many times I hear people saying that I'm not going to go to the doctor because I don't want to have this, because I don't have insurance, or I don't want to pay this out of pocket, or I haven't met my deductible. So being able to say to an insurance company, like, hey, this is why we need to be able to get this PET scan done sooner, is actually something that's really helpful. But it more is just the way that technology is advancing and what we can see with the PET scan is actually very helpful. So, and I don't work on that side, but there are teams that work on early intervention. There is just as much, if not the same, there's just as much, if not more, probably resources on that side, trying to figure out what we can do to have early detection.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, the earlier you can detect, the better your odds are that you can reach a remission point, correct?
Yes, exactly. And once again, that is going to depend kind of on the type of cancer and kind of where that is. There is still that variability in where is it, what does it look like, how aggressive is this cancer?
Right. Yeah.
But yes, having information up front is clearly a benefit.
Okay, so now my second question from before relates back to where you were talking about the genes. Mm-hmm. Can you tell in a cancer what might have been environmentally induced versus what may have been let's say, genetically induced, or is there really no difference and you have to sort of do a history on the patient to try to figure that out?
It usually comes down to the history. There's nothing that like the actual specimen is going to tell us that it came
Okay.
from. Actually, one of my own fun random experiments, clearly not scientific in any way, shape, or form, but one of the hospitals that I used to work at, there was a certain time when they would let the patients that needed to go outside and smoke. And I used to go
Okay.
and I would ask our cancer patients and be like, hey, just out of curiosity. And one of my specialties too is I tend to work with end of life patients, and I did for many years. So I would go and kind of talk to my patients and be like, just out of curiosity, like, were you a smoker before you were diagnosed with cancer? Or did you, and then now you're just still smoking? Or did you pick up smoking when you were basically given a life sentence? And it was always interesting. That always led to these great conversations. I wish YouTube was a thing back
Back
then,
then.
to have kind of followed up on those conversations. But it was really interesting to see how many people were like, nope, like my dad died of cancer, my grandpa died of cancer. That's where my cancer come from. It had nothing to do with my smoking, 2 packs a day for this amount of years. And then it was also interesting to see what patients were like, yep, I'm going to die. So you know what? I'm going to have a cigarette, So we tried to figure that out. We've always tried to figure where are things coming from. And you might be familiar, there's a lot of studies that were actually done on twins,
Right. Yep.
that were basically saying, these actually are, when we said before, kind of like everybody's different. Well, that's actually scientifically, that's not true. There are people that are
Mhm.
actually scientifically the exact same.
Right. Yep.
But what's interesting with that is cancer will still affect those two people differently. And sometimes it actually does come from the genes, because once again, it's how genes are replicating, and how a gene is going to replicate even in one twin compared to the other twin are actually not always going to be exactly the same, because now you have an abnormality that replicates and then creates another abnormality. So now that DNA is now different than it was actually from your twin. So that's why sometimes we can give the same treatment to twins with the same type of cancer at the same stage, and all of a sudden they react completely differently.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's one
But
of the reasons why somebody who smoked 2 packs a day for 100 years doesn't get lung cancer, and somebody who's never smoked
yeah,
in their life can get lung cancer.
can get lung cancer.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, and I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's that kind of randomness
Yeah.
that makes sort of researching it almost a slog up the hill each and every day, because
Yeah.
there's obviously commonality in certain ones, but then there's these outliers. And I don't know, are
Yes.
the outliers more common than we know and they're not really outliers? Or are they just outliers and they say, you just got lucky. You just have the genetic makeup to where the 20,000 cigarettes that you've smoked aren't going to do damage to your lungs above and beyond what it does normally.
One of the weirdest things I didn't think I've ever heard about health, I wish I have to remember who said this, but someone was explaining basically that like a third of the population does everything right, and yet they die early. A third of the population does everything wrong and they outlive the other people. And then that last 30% just kind of falls everywhere in the middle.
Okay.
And I think that's true. I think there are unfortunately a lot of things that we still cannot trace to where that kind of started. And honestly, I don't know if like we want as humans to like know that. Could you imagine if you went now to a doctor and they said, hey, listen, Sean, sorry to tell you, you have cancer. And it came from that box of Wheaties you ate every single morning. There was actually something in that box of Wheaties that got you sick. So actually, Sean, you killed yourself. Would humans want to know that?
Yeah, probably not. I get your point in terms of, because I mean humans have a tendency, because we don't know the future, we focus much more on the past
Yeah.
than we even do the present. So if you're
Yes.
going to ruminate and get all down, well then psychologically you just beat yourself up on a daily basis
Yeah.
if you
It's
knew that.
almost,
So yeah, it's like not knowing the day you're going to die.
yeah.
Because if you knew that, that might change the whole thing, might
That would
change the whole
completely,
program.
that would affect, and honestly, people, and same kind of thing I was talking about with like doing everything right or wrong and then falling in the middle. That's what you would see with that. You'd have a bunch of people, at the age of 2 would be like, well, fuck this then.
Yeah.
Let me just kind of, I'll either give up or I'm going to use every single minute to the best of my advantage, or then you kind of fall in the middle.
Yeah, and and people would look at that actually using every single minute to the nth degree actually would have a deleterious effect on you because we're just not designed that way. And
Yeah.
so sort of knowing that would actually be counterproductive for you.
Yeah. But also
Okay,
people don't like living in this variable this variable world when you never know when it's going to happen either. So
very true. Look at 2020. Talk about
yes.
just sort of, the varied. Because I mean, I tested positive for COVID back
Hmm.
in April of 2020, but I was asymptomatic. And back
Yeah.
then, I wouldn't have been able to be tested. But because my wife had some symptoms, not
Yeah.
bad, she was just kind of tired. Um, because she had some symptoms, I drove her to get tested. And since I was in the car, they said, "You want to get tested?" And I said, "Okay, sure." And so it
Yeah.
came back positive, but now we both have the antibodies. We've
Yeah.
tested negative subsequently. But again, somebody else younger than me, we have a friend who's got a son who's a tremendous track athlete. He
Yeah.
got COVID and started to get fluid around his heart. And so they
Oh
had to
wow.
take him to the hospital. He was
Yeah.
in, intensive care for a few days. He made it through,
Yeah.
but it was just random that he got
Yeah.
it. And so let's actually shift it now to the correlation with COVID. I'm not going to ask
Yeah.
you about COVID itself,
Sure.
but the rapidity at which the COVID vaccines were sort
Hmm.
of approved, well, let's say researched, tested for as much as they could test in 8 months, and then approved to be used. Do you see that changing your world of cancer research to where some of these drugs may not have to go through as arduous a process as before?
Um, I don't, just because I also feel like a lot of what happened now is a little bit more uh, kind of a political move and also financially backed. I feel like there was very heavy pressure, clearly, in we need to change what's going on in this pandemic.
Hmm.
Um, Not saying that we don't care about cancer patients. Not saying we don't care about. I mean, we do clinical research trials for everything under the sun. Not saying that those other things aren't cared about. And honestly, I kind of more worry about the research process that was done to be able to get to that point rather than the approval process. We actually do have within the clinical world this emergency use authorization. So we actually do have in place a way that we can say, like, this needs to be a little bit more fast tracked with the
Okay.
approval process. So those are things that we've always had access to, that's always been around. And we use it on a regular basis, but we usually use it on more of a one-to-one basis, meaning this particular patient has a problem that can be solved by this, we think, but we need authorization to try that.
Oh,
So
okay.
so for me within cancer, for example, I'll have a patient that'll come in. Most of the patients that I live with, that I work with, when I say that I work with end of life patients, means that they have less than 3 months to live. There's nothing that we can do to really. They're not going to just get up and walk out of bed at that point.
Hmm.
For a lot of those patients, we're really looking at just kind of making them comfortable, but also kind of testing. I feel like part of my job when I worked more directly with patients, I don't do that anymore, but when I work directly with patients, I almost felt like I was kind of saying, like, hey, listen, would you be willing to kind of donate your body to science while you're still alive?
Yep.
That was basically what I was asking them to do. And it's been great that so many people were willing to kind of go through that. But let's say I had something that we wanted to test on a patient that I thought, kind of like our Hail Mary here, might help. Let's give this one last kind of try. That was a route that I could go and say, I want to give this patient this chemotherapy. I think it would work, not me, but an actual doctor. They would make that decision and say, let's actually try this. Then I would be able to actually go through that emergency authorization process to be allowed to kind of use that drug. There clearly are kind of steps that are skipped. There clearly are, a little bit more leeway in what is allowed and what is not allowed.
Sure.
But there is a process that we actually do have that allows us. And once again, we can't just say, well, now that we know that we can get things processed so quickly, let's just put everything through that file, because
Yeah.
that's clearly going to create a bottleneck.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I can't imagine what type of conversation you would have ethically of, well, which diseases are we going to allow through that? Okay, cancer are we going to let more cancer studies go through that? Or, are we going to let other vaccination programs go through that? Like whose sickness is worse? I mean,
Right.
that's not, that's kind of crossing. I feel like that's kind of crossing a little bit of an ethical line to have somebody, down in DC deciding who gets to go fast track and who doesn't.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, in certain countries that have sort of universal health care, there are boards that sort of make these decisions for people, in terms
Yes.
of ranking them. Well, let's see how sick you are and whatnot. And so that's not a political statement. That's just the reality of the way
No,
those
we do
processes
that here.
work. Yeah,
That part we do here.
yeah, somewhat.
Even in an emergency room, you go into emergency
Right.
room,
It's triage.
they triage you.
Yeah.
We'll still do the same thing, but I'm talking about it more on that, like that larger scale,
Yeah.
saying, well, cancer is worse than AIDS. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
how can you put, if you look at the individual, I feel a little more comfortable about that than if you were just going to say, okay, we're going to let all breast cancer treatments to the front of the line, but pancreatic cancer, you guys don't have a good prognosis, so we're going to throw you at the end. Like to
Yep.
group in that general statement, I think that's a bit much.
So, and again, look at this. We're already at 40 minutes, but we're going to keep going. So I love our conversations and especially this one. So give me your sense of the overall state of cancer research.
Mm-hmm.
And then for as much as you can, tell me cancer treatments. Are we
For cancer?
Yeah, for cancer in general, not for anything specific. Are we in a good spot? Are we still sort of nascent in terms of our research and treatment? Where do we stand at this moment?
I think immunotherapy, which is kind of a newer still treatment within our world, I think that's kind of changing what the name of the game looks like. You're seeing different types of treatments pop up that have become incredibly helpful. One of actually the biggest changes that I feel like is actually helpful, which seems tiny, or might not seem like it's necessarily helping so much, but actually is being able to have oral chemotherapy where you can just take a pill at home.
Right.
You don't have to go into a hospital and sit there for 5 hours for 4 days straight to go get chemo. There tends to also be a little bit less side effects that we're seeing with those, but being able to be in your own home, I think, is incredibly important. Give some people some type of regularity within their own life. So I think being able to move to an oral chemotherapy, I think that was a huge advancement that we have. I think with immunotherapy, which is basically
before you go on, I was just about to say, can you explain to people what
yes.
immunotherapy is? Because I'm familiar with it because a good friend of mine, that's how his skin cancer was treated. So
okay. So the most basic way is basically using then the healthy cells in our body to help fight off those cancerous cells. That's the most basic way to really explain it. What we're actually doing is we tend to take some of your healthy T cells and we are able to give them a little bit extra support so that way they can go back into your body and actually kind of fight your cancer cells.
Pump them full of steroids, make them really big and strong.
Pretty much.
Yeah,
that's pretty much what we're doing. I think we are really, that's still so new. That's still so new when it comes to what advancements we have in the medical field. For perspective on that, once again, I've been doing cancer research for over 10 years, and I'd been working on a drug at one specific hospital, one type of chemotherapy. I left the field, as I said, I went, did my little John over in Spain, was there for, 5 years or so, came back, and I actually was picked up that same drug study. And it had like moved a little bit in the advancement of drug studies, but still, like, it was not something that it still wasn't approved. And these changes that we make are incredibly slow. The work that really goes into that research and how many data points we look at and how slow the study has to be for this specific topic to go to this specific topic, and how I can't just do research on people with lymphoma. It has to be a very set, tiny cohort of what type of lymphoma I'm looking for to make sure they're like a homogeneous group. So to really make advancements, that does take a lot of time. I do think immunotherapy, using our own bodies to fight off then these abnormal cells, I think that's a brilliant idea, but we are so at the tip of the iceberg of that. It's definitely going to be interesting to see what those treatments will do. When you think about it too, there's other treatments that are kind of we're moving past. You don't hear as many people going for just radiation treatments. Maybe they'll get radiation in between, but that's not looked at For some cancers, yes, but for most cancers, that's usually not your first line therapy anymore.
Right.
So how we are treating cancer is very different than it was 5, 10 years ago, let alone 50.
Well, and that was the amazing thing about my friend's cancer, because his cancer was skin cancer, but it had moved inside to his lungs.
Yeah.
He had some spots on his brain, but they weren't terribly worried about those.
Hmm.
I could make a joke there about, it wasn't going to affect anything anyway, kind of deal, because I'm hoping he watches this one day, because he knows who he is.
Yeah.
But so to your point, they said, look, this is sort of our last shot. It's
Yeah.
what we think we can treat, because he's had bouts for 15 years with different
Yeah.
bouts with skin cancer. And they gave
Wow.
him the immunotherapy. And I don't know, I forget what his timetable was in terms of how often he went in for treatments, but within 3 months, they
Yeah.
were basically saying, we can't detect anything anymore.
Yeah. That's
So
great.
we don't say you're cancer free. We just
Hmm.
can't detect. There's not enough in you right now for
Yeah.
us in our current state to detect it. And so he's been good. Now this is almost 2 years. So
That's great.
yeah, I would knock on wood, but it would shake the camera. So I don't want to do that. So are you going to, because you have lady landlords and you do have, you're like kind of like me, you have an eclectic taste when it comes to
Yeah.
what you want to do with your life. Will you
Yeah.
stay in cancer research much longer, do you think?
No.
Okay.
Probably about another 3 years
Okay.
when I hit a milestone birthday.
When you hit a milestone.
When I hit that milestone birthday, that's
It's not going to be the same milestone birthday I just celebrated, but it'll
it
be a
won't be the
different one.
same, but it'll still be it's getting closer.
Yeah.
But no, that's kind of the plan. I think that's one of the reasons that I've worked in cancer research and then kind of left and kind of come back. When my first jobs, when I was working really with patients and I was meeting and I worked with lymphoma and leukemias, you're also going to come across a lot of kids that are
Yeah.
sick. So really, like some of my earlier jobs was going and sitting down with a family when they were just told that their kid was diagnosed, or when they were just told, hey, unfortunately, your 5-year-old son is kind of beyond the point of return here. I was then the person that would walk in. And once again, I was younger. I was like in my early 20s. Who decided somebody in their early 20s should have done this? I have no idea. But like, I'd be like in my early 20s, like walking and talking to these parents being like, hey, so your kid's going to die. Can I test him with a bunch of drugs? They're not going to help him, but maybe they'll help some kid in the future.
Right.
That was really kind of tough. That was really kind of taxing on me. And then also on the other hand, so now you have this like incredibly emotional reaction with these patients that you're seeing. And, I've seen probably more autopsies than I would ever like. I've seen a lot of people die that, it's incredibly tough. Like a lot of doctors, that's why they always say like, don't necessarily have that good bedside manner. And it's like, well, they can't, like they had to become so hardened to this
Right.
to kind of do their job. But for me, I feel like it kind of needed a good balance, because what happened is that I was able to do those jobs and get through that knowing that I was doing something good through like the research side. The problem is that there still is a lot of red tape. And it's so slow moving that you're not really kind of seeing those rewards kind of pop up so quickly that it's almost hard to kind of remember your end goal. So for me, I kind of had to make my own end goal, which is that like, I need to make sure that I'm doing what I can to enjoy my life, which is why I said, you know what, I'm going to leave working with end of life patients and I'm going to go move to a beach, like it was something I really needed to kind of do for me and kind of take a break. And then I went back to it because I still do find value in it. And then my role has really shifted. Like I said, I don't work with patients anymore. For a long time, I actually used to do the contracts and budgets between hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. So that's always fun, looking at all the dollars going back and forth.
Yeah, I don't envy you reading those documents.
Yeah. And then now, yeah, that's also true. They're not exactly page turners for sure. And then now my position is really overseeing a lot of where we kind of do our research, and kind of like what you were saying earlier about just how our medical care systems are. The research world is the same way. If I have a study, we work with research centers all over the world in my current position. If I can't find, if the FDA is not going to let me do something, well, maybe I'll just go to Europe then, because they will. there are other countries in other parts of the world that actually are more advanced in certain techniques because of what their ethic board looks like, with what their approval system looks like. There are just less restrictions in different places. So you kind of have to look at those. But personally for me, no, I want to move back to my beach. I don't know if I'll stay there forever. I will clearly always be working and doing something on the side of my day job. But no, I don't see myself getting a cake that says like happy retirement day from a pharmaceutical company when I'm in my 70s. Like that ain't me.
Well, you don't know that yet because again, when
Yeah.
we do our part 2 interview to talk about all your other history and what have you, I go back to Godfather 3. They pull me back in.
That is true.
So,
I mean, I've quit research, like 4 or 5 times now, and here I am back in it. So
yeah.
yes, I cannot predict what'll happen, but my personal passion tends to lie out of the corporate world.
Gotcha.
So it's really seeing if I could find a way to do something within cancer research that gives a little more freedom to kind of fit my out of the box personality.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe then I will, but that's kind of untold at this time.
Yeah, but you know what? I think that you may always end up going back because they may pay you a bonus just to play on their corporate softball team. So
that is true.
Yeah, people don't know this, but you're looking at a phenomenal softball player right now.
Yeah.
So
that's my thing.
Yeah, the corporate world's always going to bring you back because they want to win that that inner pharmaceutical softball challenge every summer and whatnot.
Which we are very competitive about, oddly enough.
Well, that's how you met your husband, isn't it?
Yes, that is
on a
how
softball field
playing softball. Yeah.
Oh, very nice.
Yep, that was
very nice.
How
okay, so you answered one of my last questions about how all the research and what have you had affected you and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So if let's say you stay in, let's say another 3 years, what do you expect or since you said it's slow moving, will nothing have really changed much, but where do you see, let's say the treatment's going, the research going in the next 3 years that you're going to be around in this industry?
Nothing different in 3 years.
Okay.
Nothing.
Just too short a time frame.
Yeah, too short a time frame. We will maybe the studies that I'm working on currently won't even be over in 3 years.
Okay. That just gives people a sense of how long it takes and why this disease, well, all forms of it, is so difficult because you can't even get the data in less than a decade, I guess. Because you need enough of a sample size and enough reactions to sort of justify what the numbers are trying to tell you, if you can discern anything from them. So,
yes.
Okay, well, then good. Then you're going to stay in it for at least another 3 years. That will make me feel good knowing that somebody like you is still in the game.
Thank you.
So that's it. We've gone well past my my 35-40 minutes, but I knew we would, and I greatly appreciate it. This was everything I hoped for. I didn't even get to a couple of my questions because we went off on tangents that I'm glad we did.
Okay.
But this was fantastic. You're a great sport, as always.
Thank you.
Basically, the people just watched a conversation Rebecca and I would have had if we were just sitting down at a cafe or a diner in the city, because we've done this
so nice.
innumerable times and what have you. So, but I really want to thank you.
Recorded it for other people.
Yes, exactly. Now we're going to publicize it and hopefully get people to watch it. So, I don't know when this is going to air, but I will make sure to promote it far and wide because this is really interesting information. So I want to thank you again. It was really nice of you to do this a week before Christmas. And I wish you and yours a good holiday.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you very much. And for everybody watching, I want to thank you again. You've been watching Did You Know That? ? The channel where I get to talk to interesting people like Rebecca about interesting topics, sometimes annoying topics as well. New episodes every Thursday. If you like the episodes, be sure to subscribe with the bell so you'll get notified when the new episodes come live. Again, for Rebecca Nova, my name is Sean O'Rourke. Thank you very much for joining us. And until next time, you all be good.